Good evening, everyone. I'm Ed Gallagher. I'm president of the American Scandinavian Foundation, and I'm delighted to welcome you to our headquarters, Scandinavia House in Nordic Center in America, for this evening's talk and discussion on Nordic Socialism, which is being presented in conjunction with the publication of a new book, Nordic Socialism, The Path Toward a Democratic Economy, by Pelle Dragsted, who is with us and will be the key speaker in the panel discussion tonight. We're very pleased to welcome him, and he will be joined this evening by Bhaskar Sunkara, who is the founding editor of Jacobin and the president of The Nation magazine. He's also the author of the Socialist Manifesto, The Case for Radical Politics in the Era of Extreme Inequality. And also by Eric Blanc, assistant professor of labor studies at Rutgers University. So I ask you to welcome them to the stage. Gentlemen.
How's everybody doing? Oh, that's a little okay. How are you all doing? This is a socialist event, so we gotta be a little more social. Yeah, so thanks for everyone coming out here. The framework is we're gonna have a discussion for about an hour with us, and then there'll be time for Q&A, okay? So keep your questions pending. With no further ado, maybe we could just start off, Pelle, if you could talk a little bit about why you wrote the book, and then maybe situate that in the context of the party that you're from, and like how you connect it to the political tradition that you're in now, and maybe where you came from.
Yeah, okay. Welcome everybody, and thank you so much also to the Scandinavia House for hosting the event. Also, thank you to the support from the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation, who has generously supported our trip, and also to Walter Strakowski, who has been supporting also this book tour around the country. But to get to to my book, yeah, I think it's obvious to many people that capitalism left to itself, or capitalism as we know it, is not a viable system, a viable solution, and that is not kind of a big news on the left. So it's not hard to argue that capitalism, not kind of by bug, but as a feature, creates enormous inequality. And what we're seeing right now in front of our eyes is that this economic equality translates into political power and influence, what a good American friend, Bernie Sanders, calls oligarchy. Because it's obvious that when a tiny elite controls vast resources, not only economic resources, but also kind of the control of the apparatus of production, they will have an enormous power that doesn't rest in any democratic mandate, but only rest in wealth and control. So I think it's getting more and more obvious that we cannot continue like this. Also, now with this system and the way of this kind of profit-oriented way of organizing production and distribution is threatening the very foundation of our planet. So that is kind of the easy part. It's no news. So the big question is there an alternative to this way of organizing production and economy? And my book is kind of a contribution to try to draw a viable alternative. And I kind of take my inspiration from Nordic experience. Because what the Nordic experience shows us in the history, but also in our everyday life, is that it is possible to organize production, to organize economic activity, to organize an economic system in a way that is far more fair, and that it is not kind of at the cost of freedom. I would argue that Nordic people have much more real freedom than, for example, the American people. not despite of, but because of our welfare system and strong welfare institution and common ownership of a part of the economy. And this does not come at the expense of efficiency. Many right-wing pundits would say, if you have a strong welfare state or big state, some taxation, then it will kind of take innovation and effectivity out of the economy. But if you compare the Nordic economies to the US economy, for example, our productivity per capita is higher, our employment rate is higher, and we are among some of the wealthiest countries in the world. So I think that in these times, and not least the times that we're experiencing right now also with the re-election of Donald Trump, we really need people to believe that there are alternatives, not only to kind of Trumpism, but also to the status quo that he was kind of a rebellion against, because people do not want to go back to that system, and they have kind of looked through, and that also the Democratic Party and the elites of that party was kind of influenced in an extreme degree by what I call oligarchic power, making it impossible for them to deliver for working people and for the possibilities and freedom and safeness of working people. So I hope, I wrote, of course, this book for the Nordic audience, and it was out in Danish and Finnish and Swedish. But of course, it would be a great hope for me that if this book could make just a tiny contribution to the other America, that I think is the majority of the population that is dreaming of something different, not only different from what the terrible things going on right now in your country, but also an alternative to what you have had during the last 20, 30 years of neoliberal centrism, you could call it.
So I guess I'm wondering, when actually quite successfully, when we were trying to make socialism less of a scary word in the United States, a lot of our political leaders, like Bernie Sanders, would often point to Denmark or point to other examples of more redistributive states and say, look, socialism isn't anything to be scared of. And I think the less smart responses from the right was to say, yes, those are socialist states and those are bad, but the good, smart responses from both right and left would often be, well, in fact, these are capitalist states, because these are states in which the motor of production and investment, entrepreneurial risk, all that is borne by capitalists. And yes, there's stronger unions. Yes, there's more redistribution and power at the shop floor, and also redistribution, ex post redistribution. But these are fundamentally capitalist states. And there were others on the left who looking at even favorably upon Denmark and Sweden and Norway and other countries would say that even at its best, when these states were properly social democratic, those days are kind of behind us. And now these states are increasingly looking more like the United States and less like the former model. So I'm wondering, how do you interpret this current state of, let's say, the Scandinavian model as a whole, or the model in particular in Denmark? Is it has its demise been overstated? Is it correct to kind of see the model as basically being, if not gone yet, but trending in that direction?
It's quite funny with this American right-wing pundits that say, no problem, that is not socialism, it's capitalism. And then if you ask them, no, okay, but then let's introduce this kind of welfare system in the US. No, it's socialism. I think there's a meme describing this. It is quite funny. But of course, I'm not claiming that the Nordic economies are fully socialist. Not at all. We are economies dominated by capitalist relations. The most of the companies are owned by equity or by capital funds or shareholders and are concentrated on democratic ownership. But a main key message of my book on the more theoretical level is that we should leave the idea of economies being, leave the binary idea of looking at describing an economy of either capitalist or socialist. Instead, understanding that every society is hybrid. You don't have had any economy in the world that was purely capitalist. It would not function. And even in the worst day of Stalinism, and I don't have take any inspiration for this totalitarian, terrible versions of socialism, but even there you had capitalist ownership and market forces. So an important point for me is that we should do away with the idea that it's kind of a binary choice, that instead we have more or less, so a country or an economy could be more or less socialist and more or less capitalist. And that helps us to understand, for example, the differences between an economy like the US and the Nordic economies. Because if we just say it's capitalist countries, how can we understand the vast differences in the freedom and possibilities of people? So, for example, for people in Denmark, it's hard to understand even that a major cause of personal bankruptcy in the US is healthcare. So, or that you are dependent on having a job or on your employer for having access to healthcare, because for us it's so normal that it's a human right and it's a social right, and it's obvious for me that that creates a society in which people are more autonomous, more free, less dependent on people being able to dominate them. So both countries are dominated by capitalism and capitalist ownership, but in a different degree. And that also, to your questions about the state of the Nordic countries today, explains the differences between Nordic countries in the 70s or in the 80s and today, because it's obvious that in the last 2 or 3 or 4 decades even, we have had kind of a neoliberal counter-offensive that have eroded some of the gains that we made during the 100 years from 1870s to the 970s, privatizing a lot of public corporations, demutualizing a lot of cooperatives, doing away with some welfare programs. So I would say that the Nordic countries are less socialist today than they were 30 years ago, but they are still far more socialist than the most other countries in the world. And that makes a difference in people's life. It's not just kind of words, it's about people's possibilities to live good lives, to have control over their lives, not to being fragile, and not to, having to fear that if they have a cancer diagnosis, that they have to sell their house or take their children out of high school. It's incredible that you allow this kind of system to, and I know a lot of good people are fighting to get through that. But so it's just a way to say that I think if we start to look at societies more as hybrids, what I try to do in the book is to describe how do we put more socialism into that mix. So if I should say it really simple, my message to the American public would be go Nordic, but it would also be go further, put even more socialism into the mixture in the economy in order to, because what we have experienced during the last decades is exactly that. During a lot of years, the parties of the working class and the unions were dominating Danish politics, so they were governing for maybe 50 years with few exceptions. And during that time, and that's kind of my critique of traditional social democracy, they made a lot of redistribution of wealth with taxation. But they kind of left a lot of the economic power still in the hand of a tiny elite, economic elite. And there was a famous Danish minister, a social democratic minister, saying, why should we kill the golden goose when it lay golden eggs? In other ways, let the capitalists create the wealth, and then we make sure that it is distributed to all citizens. And that functioned really well for a lot of years, and in some degree still is functioning in some degree, because our equality, of course, is way different from here. But in the end, because they kind of never really challenged the ownership, it was easy when the economy, due to the oil crisis and other issues, went in a crisis, and there was high unemployment, and the worker movement was lost strength. It was easy for them to roll back a lot of the gains that my parents and grandparents had made. So I think it's pertinent that when progressive forces get to power, that we not only is thinking about redistributing through taxes, but are thinking about democratizing ownership in our economy. And my book is a lot about that, how to do that, because it is obvious that it has been tried to do in really bad ways by people calling themselves socialist. But what I point to as inspiration and experience is the Danish welfare model and the cooperative, vast cooperative movement of Denmark. That is to say, direct ownership by consumers, by workers, by associations. That is a kind of decentralized but democratic ownership model that I favor in my book.
One thing this raises, and I think we should come back to it, is how the argument you're making is different and maybe in some ways overlaps with social democracy at its height, not current social democracy. So we'll put a pin on that and come back to it. I want to push you and ask to develop on, I think, again, it was really at the core of the argument you're making in the book, is that capitalism isn't as totalizing a system as people on the right and left assume. And so the devil's advocate argument would be, for instance, on public services. If it were true that public services under capitalism are sort of islands of socialism, then we would see and feel the difference more consistently, and the logic of capital wouldn't sort of dominate even the way some of these services are organized. Or similarly, as a parallel thing to co-ops, can co-ops actually escape market forces, or do they end up replicating the overarching system? So this is in part a question, to be more specific, of what you yourself mentioned in the book at various times that public services themselves can become undemocratic. So just because, that sometimes they can be too top down, and that the co-op system also needs some support to get moving in the continued direction you're looking. I'm wondering then how you see the qualitative, what makes the public service more socialist than, or a co-op, sort of in the direction that you would like to see, and not maybe something that is public in name, but that functions under the logic more of capitalism?
I think to answer first the most simple question, what is the difference between a cooperative or a public institution and a capitalist enterprise? Of course, it's mainly two things. One is governed democratically. If we talk about public institutions, for example, our hospitals or our educational institutions, they are governed by people that we elected. I can't elect the people leading Blackstone or BlackRock, for that sake. So, of course, that is one big difference. They are accountable to us. We're not always good at using that influence. A lot of, as you said, public institutions and also co-ops kind of lost their democratic spirit. Some of them even we have a really big mortgage lender. The biggest mortgage lender in Denmark is a cooperative. I should say that until 1990, we didn't have kind of capitalist-owned mortgage in Denmark. Everything was cooperatively owned or owned by state funds. So that's incredible to think about today, where mortgage lending is kind of the motor of modern financial capitalism, but it's only 30 years ago. Okay, so that is the first difference. The other one, of course, is that these kind of enterprises, public or cooperative, don't lead to the concentration of wealth. So when I go to Brugsen Co-op, our second biggest grocery store in Denmark, grocery store chain, and do my daily shopping, there's no Jeff Bezos gaining from that. Because if there is a turnover, it is distributed among the members through discounts. When I put on my heat, there is no kind of capitalist gaining money and power from that, because the heat company is owned cooperatively or or by the local government. And when I'm living in a housing co-op, 1 in every 5 housing units in Denmark is owned by cooperatively in a national system of cooperatives. So the housing unit is not owned by, I can't claim the money when the value goes up. So it's a commonly owned cooperative, but governed democratically but by the tenants. So when I live there, I do not, with my rent, contribute to making Blackstone even richer. And this is important because the main argument of my book is that in every society, at least where capitalism still exists, we have 2 sources of power. One is democratic power. That is the one you have, for example, when you elect local politicians, or if you're a member of a co-op and elect the leadership, or a trade union, or elect your leadership. That is democratic power. And then we have oligarchic power. And that is a power in our society that don't have any kind of democratic mandate. So that would be the power of the billionaires that supported Andrew Cuomo's kind of negative ad campaign against Soren Mamdani. That would be oligarchic power. And what we need to do in order to defend democracy in our countries is to reduce, and in the end, we should abolish oligarchic power and strengthen democratic power. And by every cooperative that we form, by every area of the economy that we take out of the marketplace and with a difficult word, decommodify, meaning changing something that was a commodity to a social right. Every time that we are doing that, we are kind of taking away oligarchic power and strengthening democratic power. So that is a main difference. That doesn't mean that all cooperatives are kind of a paradise for their workers or their owners, and that the democracy functions good, and some of them even have bad habits. We have a big cooperative agricultural sector in Denmark, and their kind of habits regarding our environment and pollution is not really good. You know, Denmark has more pigs than we have humans, and so I hope it was more or less a
that's a good
response.
answer.
Yeah.
So I want to push you on one thing that you said, because I think it doesn't reflect what's actually in the book, which is, you said earlier that you don't think there's a pure version of capitalism or a pure version of socialism, and I would agree for the first part, in that there's no pure version of capitalism, because any capitalists have all sorts of collective action problems that they need the state to mediate. So they need a state to do certain things. They need certain functions to be socialized and so on. So it's hard to imagine, even in the abstract, what a truly free anarcho-capitalist society would would look like. And even the most extreme libertarians, the Hayeks and Milton Friedmans of the world and so on would agree with that. But when it comes to the idea that there's no, let's say, break, there's no point where you go from just putting doses of socialism within a capitalist political economy to just creating a fully socialist society, I think the amount of time you spend in the book talking about the development of cooperatives, of new forms of social ownership would indicate there is actually a point and a reason why, let's say if we have a society in which certain of the key things that in the old language of the left we would call the commanding heights of the economy were run by the state, and certain of those key big functions were democratized. So you could think about it like a hand. Like you have your 4 fingers, or a thumb and 4 fingers, other fingers. And the thumb might be very good at certain things, like, for example, so I'm stretching this analogy, but let's say, certain routinized tasks like mass vaccinations, or building big polytechnical institutes, or administrating even healthcare on a British National Health Service lines. The state is very good at certain things, but certain nimble things, when you're adapting or responding to consumer demands or changes in productions or things like that, that's stuff that state planning has not proved very, very good at. But let's say you have your thumbs for the big things, the commanding heights, and then you have, like you describe in your book, different forms of encouraging worker control of production when it comes to other sectors where you might want the responsiveness of a market. I think in the final vision that you lay out there, it's a society without capitalists. So you have a society in which there's obviously some market, which I personally think would be a good thing, but you don't have a class of capitalists that could reproduce themselves, that have all the traits that you would consider in a capitalist society, like wage labor and so on. So I think in the book you do actually get to the point, or at least lay out a vision of a society that goes beyond where capitalism is, and that does suggest to me that there is some type of end goal, even if there's always politics and there's always room for people to change their mind and change the system or go back and so on. So it does seem a little bit different than the way you laid it out earlier.
I think what have been kind of mind-provoking for me writing the book and trying to challenge my own idea of this binary understanding of capitalism and socialism is that in the left we have kind of had this kind of almost spatial understanding of capitalism. So we were talking about you can do reforms inside capitalism or outside capitalism, as if capitalism was kind of a physical thing that you could define in that way. But societies are complex. There are thousands of and millions of interactions every day. So I think it's very difficult. I've been asked sometimes, but when can you say that you went to a socialist economy? And I think it's really it's difficult, and is also maybe not important. So what I suggest in the book is an economy where democracy is a governing principle. So that we're able to take decisions about the thumb things together. That we have an economy where power rests with normal people and democratic institutions. And I think that is an important point, not to call it something in a special situation, but to analyze where is power, does it stem from, how do we change the relations of power. So my kind of, what I suggest as a goal, if we should say it like that, I don't really like the ideas of that there's some kind of end station for society. I think humans will continue forever to change our relations in our societies. But what I suggest is an economy that is as dominated by democratic socialist relations or an ownership, as the economy today is dominated by capitalism, non-democratic ownership. And the important thing is that it should make it possible for us, so the direction and the framework of the economy is something that we decide democratically, not something that is up to non-elected oligarchs to decide. And I think that you could get to that point. But for some on the left, then it has been so important to make one uniform model for ownership, for example. And I can't see the reason why the deli shop on the corner should be socialized or be a co-op. Of course, if the people want to, they should form a cooperative. But the problem with the system that we have today are not it's not private ownership of any kind of economic enterprise. It is an extreme concentration of wealth and power. So we should have our focus on that and trying to counter that oligarchic power. And what I suggest in the book is ways of doing that. And then I think how far we will come in that process is up to us. Is up to democratic deliberation, and I should say it's also a question of, are we ready to take this responsibility? Are we ready to be owners of our workshop? Are we ready to be owners of our utilities? Will we, or maybe we are not, and then it is impossible to create this kind of democratic economy. So I think we are. I think people want to have more freedom and autonomy and power in their life. And I think the problem is that a lot of people think that it is impossible. And what I try to do with the book is show it is possible. Socialism is not some kind of utopia. It is real and living in a lot of institutions where it's not the pursuit of profit that kind of sets the agenda, or where decisions are taken by democratic structures, and it functions, and it is effective, and it delivers, and it delivers on people's wants and needs. In the book I of course describe the social economy of the Nordic countries. So I talked about housing, grocery stores, utilities, mortgage lending, and of course our public sector, and it's complex economies. It's not easy to have a healthcare system. It's a complex economic enterprise, but it's possible. And of course it would also be possible to democratize other parts of the thumb in order to increase democratic influence.
I actually agree with that. And Bhaskar, incidentally, has a book on
When I met Eric, he was an ultra-leftist, and I tried to push him a little bit to the right, and he just kept going,
But I do think on a political level, if we leave aside the theoretical level, although I'm open to that argument, on a political level, it is just way easier to say that socialism can work and it's working, and it's much more complicated as an agitation to explain, though actually the social democracies in the Nordic countries aren't actually what we envision. So I actually think there's something strong to the utility of saying, look, it can be done, and we just need to expand that. And I think that is both true and agitationally much easier than our somewhat more complicated answer. That being said, I do think there's likely, and this is maybe a distinct question, is likely, based on our experience in history, that at a certain point, even if you're not going to a full social society, the capitalists are going to try to stop you. And we saw this maybe most famously in Sweden in the late 1970s. And so I'll use that as a transition to one of the questions I have, which is, when we think about social democracy today, the assumption when we talk about it is these are people who really had their eyes set no further than capitalism. But when you go back and read actually the history and what a lot of them said, actually a lot of them did have, up until relatively recently, the goal of sort of ever-expanding democratic control. And so I guess my question for you then is, to make this case today also requires some sort of balance sheet of how to avoid the limitations of going down that route? Because it seems to me very fraught, and I actually don't have an answer. I don't know if there is an answer, but to the extent that you're working within the rules of the parliamentary game, and you're working in a system in which you have to win majorities, and in which the capitalist power is really strong, there are strong moderating tendencies and necessary compromises, but then that can become a sort of reinforcing mechanism. So I'm wondering, based on your experience in parliament, and also your reading of history, what do you see as necessary so that you can keep on pushing and not sort of fall back into retreat as most of the parties did?
That's a really good question. We also have the Mitterrand experience from the early 80s. Mitterrand was elected in France in a radical program of kind of taking over some of banks and insurance companies and so on, but he was defeated in 6 months by capital flight. And so, of course, there will be strong opposition. It's obvious that the ones that having oligarchic power today don't want to see that power to be democratized. So, but I think also that the history shows us that it is possible. I use quite a lot of time to describe the cooperative movement in Denmark. It was founded by peasants in a time where they were totally excluded from democracy. They were without economic resources. Few of them had went to school, maybe to high school, you know, the ideas of Grundtvig. And of course, Grundtvigianism was a major reason for that cooperative movement to grow, because it was an idea that we can do this ourselves. We don't need the state, and we don't need the patrons. So when they started to form their own slaughterhouses and dairies and the whole agricultural sector in just 20, 30 years was converted from undemocratic oligarchic ownership to cooperatives. And they met fiercely resistance from the one who owned the private slaughterhouses. So they were met with economic sabotage. They couldn't get money in the banks. Okay, so they created their own financial institutions. They tried to co-opt them. I have a famous passage in the book where the Danish oligarch called Tietgen, he wants the cooperative of the slaughterhouses to, let's do a common trust. And this farmer is cited from saying, the difference between you and me is that in my corporation, we have one person, one vote. In your way of driving corporation, it's $1 or krone, one vote. And I'm not stupid. I know who will going to decide and have the power if we join our forces. And then he said no. And in the end, this private slaughterhouse went away. They bankrupted. So this history is just to say that it's not the first time in history that normal people have kind of challenged this kind of economic power. And today we have resources, we are well educated, but one thing is the same, we are the majority. So and one thing is even better today, we have democracy. So this is this famous article, I don't know if it's famous, but I read it some years ago by, I think it's David Kalanitsky. He made this article arguing that actually, so his main argument is what leftist people have been saying all times is, no, you can't make gradual change because the power of the economic elite is so big. So when you question their power and their influence, they will kind of react and turn it over. But his argument is, yes, there is an oligarchic power, there is a power of economic elites, but there's also a democratic power. So the politician, of course, they are influenced by oligarchic power. We have been seeing that in an extreme degree in the United States. and it also seems that people are kind of rebelling against it now. But you also have a democratic power, and we are the majority. Working people are the majority in every capitalist economy. So it's not that I'm saying that it's easy, but to say that that what some poor, uneducated peasants was doing 150 years ago shouldn't be able for us today, I don't believe it. I think it's possible.
I think the most difficult part of any transition is we can imagine a version of capitalism with lots of redistribution, or a version of social democracy functioning, where we create the conditions in which it's profitable and stable for capitalists to invest, and we tax them after the fact. We can imagine that working, and we could probably, at least we can imagine, a fully socialist or a very socialist economy functioning where you have cooperatives that might be, at least profit maximizing cooperatives in a regulated system, plus more of the economy being democratized or decommodified. We can imagine that, but the democratic mandate becomes trickier when you're in this middle period where you've created conditions in which it's very difficult for capitalists to stably invest, and you've gone kind of too far for capitalism but not far enough for socialism. And I think sometimes when we look at the experiences of the 20th century, we miss the extent to which public opinion had turned against left-wing governments in this intermediary period. Like if our analysis of Chile in 1973 is just that the CIA and Kissinger did it, then we miss kind of the revolt of not just the middle class, but also large segments of the working class against the Popular Unity government. But that's all an aside. And what I really want to ask you is, so we've talked a lot about the model of what a more socialist economy could look like. And we talked a little bit about the fraught question of transitioning towards that sort of economy. But I'm wondering who in your vision actually does this change? Because I think traditionally in the socialist vision, we used to be able to very directly and clearly say, there's a group of people who, because of their position, particularly in production, have a vested interest in greater socialization. And for most of the 20th century, at least in the 19th century, you could say that the working class as a whole was voting largely for parties that wanted a reformist route to some sort of more socialized economy. And us on the far left, we would push them towards wanting a more revolutionary route to that same end. But there was an alignment of their class position and their voting or support and so on. I don't mean total alignment, but I mean 60% alignment or 55% alignment or something like that. But today, I think a lot of us on the left struggle with the fact that our social base seems to be changing, both diminishing in size, but also less coherent. Like a lot of us on the left who come from working class families, those of us who are on the left are the ones who, the one in our family who went to university, and as opposed to the one who didn't, right? And I feel like that gets to this larger question of class de-alignment. So I'm wondering how the process is unfolding in Denmark concretely, but also in the abstract, whether you think that there needs to be a different approach to how we're thinking about this question of agency while building and moving towards a socialism of the 21st century.
It's not easy questions that you're posing today, but I didn't invite you to do easy questions. No. Well, starting from this, who are the kind of the agents of change? Of course, working people, working class, if we say so, will be an important social force. It's obvious that, for example, if we want to democratize our workplace, at least a lot more than today, it is not something that can be done from above. It has to come from the shop floor. So that's obvious, but also because the working class, of course, has, as we have always known, the special power of being able to stop capitalists from making profit, and that's a powerful weapon that's a weapon that have been used to achieve a lot of the gains that we have done by strikes and so on. So, but I think it's sometimes we have been maybe too focused on the wage profit relation. It's really important, but for example now looking at the Mamdani campaign, focusing on rents, focusing on prices in the grocery stores, focusing on public transportation. It's obvious that we can raise our wages by organizing with our colleagues, but it doesn't help a lot if our rents goes up even more than our wages. So I think we're in a situation now, and that's because of course because of growing capitalist dominance, the financialization of the housing, for example, that we are, so many people are in a really personal conflict with oligarchic power. It's not only the work floor, it's where you stay, where you live, it's where you do your shopping, it's where you take your train or your bus, and then of course with the climate catastrophe that we are facing, all of us indeed are in a clash with a system dominated by profit and undemocratic ownership. So I think in order to do this, to create alliances for change, we need to focus on all these places where normal working people, and not just working people, retirees, students, small businesses, are clashing their head against the system that we are suffering under. So I think actually it is interesting to see, for example, this enormous social movement that it was behind Soren Mamdani. A good friend of mine once said that electoral campaigns are social movements. They're not only to get some people to vote for someone, it's also a moment where a lot of people are engaged and a lot of people open their ears and their mouth and engage in political debate. So, and that was kind of forming an alliance that was not only about workers, it was a broad section of the communities that are affected negatively by the way we organize economy today. So that was part of the question. Regarding the situation in the Danish left, or in the European left, we have the same problems, that we have a section of working people that have migrated to the right. We have always have a part of the working class voting right wing, but there have been a development, and it's mainly due to a discussion of migration, or what you also here call culture wars. That is to say, focus in the political debate has moved a little too much away from economy and redistribution, and has been more and more on this cultural issues, and that is a challenge. And I think that we cannot kind of, as long, that is my point of view, we cannot kind of back regarding defending the rights of transgender people, or defending the right of migrants, but what we can do is to try to, I think this cultural war issues only got that prominence because there was no difference regarding the other issues. There's a Norwegian friend of mine, an author, who wrote a book about, he studied why these working class people went to the right. He went out and lived with families and did a lot of data surveys. And in the end, he concluded that it's because during lots of years, people had the experiences that it didn't do any difference if they voted to the right or the left. Inequality growed, welfare was undermined, new privatizations. So in the end, it didn't matter. So what did matter, where there actually were differences among the two sides, was on cultural issues, migration, crime, punishment, all these questions, gender. But his argument is that if a democratic socialist left can offer real alternatives, then these issues would lose prominence. And I think we have some example of that being right. For example, the Corbyn, ended badly, but if we look at the first Corbyn election in the UK, he won a lot of districts where the UKIP, the right-wing, ultra-right-wing party, had won the previous elections. And also we have seen it now with Mamdani winning constituencies where Trump was prominent only 5-6 months ago or 8 months ago. So I think really that shows that standing on the right platform, giving hope to people that politics can change. It's not only a game of kind of scapegoating people, or it's actually something that can change your daily life and give you more freedom and opportunities. Then I think we will be able to counter that challenge. I think that's the only thing we can do. Of course, we should also face difficult questions about migration and so on, because of course there's a lot of we need to, when we talk about migration, for example, and it's terrible what is going on here in the United States with these ICE agents chasing people around. It's shocking. I think all of us are shocked about it. And of course, defending these people are an important task of the left. But we should also acknowledge that migration can have, if not dealt with in the right way, can have negative consequences for working people, and we should be able to talk about it and address it, not in the way that they are addressing it, but by finding ways that kind of goes against these negative consequences, and that is totally possible.
So before you jump in, I think that's what I was going to ask you about, which is that obviously migration isn't just a cultural issue; it's an economic issue too. Where even if we acknowledge that there's long-term benefits for a lot of countries in Europe that are that have net immigration to them, there's also short-term pressures in both the labor market and then also housing and other things. So I think a lot of what the best of the left in Europe has been able to do at times is to basically say, we have XYZ program that addresses housing costs. We have XYZ program that addresses all these other things, and also immigration's a part of creating, healthier, wealthier societies, and can be complemented with these things, but while also acknowledging that there is, even if it's a net, positive sum game, there are real pressures that people are experiencing along the way.
And I'll ask the last question then, which is building off the last one. It's the what do we do issue, and I would just say that I really appreciate your point that so many people are impacted by capital today that allows us a really broad based movement. I think there's a way of talking about that in class terms, which is helpful for getting people to see themselves as part of a united movement, which is different than the way a lot of times it's talked about. And one of the nice things about Bernie and Zoran is that it's framed the sense that it's us against the billionaires, it's working people. And that's not just if you're a factory worker, it's if you're a nurse, if you're a teacher. So I think that's helpful. But this goes to my last question, which is one of the truly difficult things we have in the US, and I think in much of the world, is that in order to start moving back or moving away from neoliberalism, we need more sort of proof of concept that electing leftists to power will actually provide benefits to people. And we're in this vicious cycle, whereas because we have significantly less power than we did before because of the rise of oligarchy, but then also, crucially, because of the decline of the labor movement, deindustrialization, and all of that, we have seen leftists come to power and not have the power to actually implement their program, which then in turn makes it easier for the right. And this is something that's going to be potentially a real danger for us here in New York City. If Zoran is elected, we're going up against the biggest corporations in the world, the establishment of both parties, and we have a labor movement outside and a left that is far weaker than it was 50 years ago or 100 years ago. So my question to you is, and this is, to end this, what do you think is the mechanism, like leave aside the transition to socialism, what would be the mechanism just to start passing social democratic reform, to start passing some of these policies that could make people feel reinvested and could counter some of this class de-alignment that we've seen so much of?
I think it's really important to think about what to deliver. And I think every time we're in power, we don't know, we shouldn't only think about delivering kind of, that my party, Enhedslisten, have been a part of governing coalitions several times. So the social democratic government needs our votes, not right now, because they've gone into historical bad government with the right-wing parties. It's not normal in Denmark that the Social Democrats joins up with right-wing parties and form a government, but they've done that. But normally, when they're in power, they need our votes to get through with the national budget. And of course, we use that to get gains for working people. But what we have experienced is that often, if we just get gains that kind of more money for childcare, for example, then in the next election, the right wing wins and they just take it away. They just change the budgets again. So what is more difficult for them is when we introduce new social rights. So for example, during the last time where we were negotiating or were part of the governing majority, we introduced free dental care for young people. And that was kind of a decommodification of a new area. Of course, it was only for the young people, but it was a start. And they haven't attacked it after we had a new government. I think that they won't because it's so popular. So I think really we should think about making gains that are really, really hard to roll back. So that's one important lesson. And then I think that we need to think about two things when we get to power, that we have kind of flagships that should be understandable and we should deliver on some of them. But we should also remember all the small wheels to turn. For example, that would never be kind of a campaign slogan. But one thing in Denmark right now, for example, the yellow trade unions, kind of the trade unions that don't negotiate, what do you call it, contracts, collective agreements, they're growing because they're kind of making radio ads that they are cheaper. And you have a tax deduction for being member of a trade union in Denmark. It's a good idea. You should have that here also. But you also have it if you're a member of this trade unions that do not themselves do anything for the workers. So, for example, what I would like to do next time we have influencers make sure that the tax deduction can only be used for and that would really change relation of forces. It's just an example, but I could give a lot of examples of how to make small twerks that really could change power, and that so you have to really think about power when you get to not just slogans and popularity, but how to change power structures. I don't think that I really answered your question about, but because of course that is a hard thing of getting to power. Is that it's of course it depends on the system. We don't have a presidential system in Denmark. We have multi-party system. So when I go to election, I would say I would work for this and that and that. But of course, I don't have the majority after an election, so I can't deliver on everything. But I really try to, or we really try to as a party, to deliver of some of the major points that we made during the election. So I think that is kind of the and then using, if you are blocked on important reforms that are popular among the people, use it and put the blame on the ones blamable. So I think I met with some of the Mamdani staffers the other day, and I think also they are prepared to kind of use that enormous energy. voluntaries on the campaign to kind of maintain the pressure afterwards, and also to have a tool to kind of argue and explain who are the responsibles if it's not possible to introduce affordable childcare, for example.
That's great. Can we have a round of applause? And we're going to have time for questions and answers. So I believe we have, do we have a mic over here? And maybe, you know, in the interest of time, more of a question than a long non-question would be appreciated.
From the left.
Yeah, this is an international problem, evidently. So raise your hand if you'd like to ask a question. I'll go over
there. Whenever I read about the wonders of Nordic socialism, and there are so many, there's always a bunch of people who say, well, can't happen here, over there, it's a homogenous society, it's all, you know, obviously not a diverse society like we have here. And I guess I see the main problem with socialist, like a big safety net that you're talking about is white supremacy here. And I don't think you have that so much in the Nordic countries because they don't have this, they have colonialism, but they don't have the tradition of slavery that we have.
Should we take one question at a time?
Yeah, let's do 2 or 3 questions, and then we'll send it back to Pelle.
Someone on this, okay, in the back.
And related to that, actually, I would love to hear more about how that will be applicable in the US for gender, because we have still inequality in terms of income between 2 genders or multiple genders.
And on this side.
I think one more thing to add on to, I guess, what they've spoken about is one of the things in the United States, and I think much of Europe as well, is this systemic idea of greed. And I think that drives so much of capitalism and so much of what we hear from the right, and sort of what you see coming from the far right is this dream of anyone from any status can be the richest in the world, whether or not it's a reality. That's the dream. And so they vote for things that they believe will lead them to that type of life. What creates the happiness and the stability in the Nordic regions that they say, this is my community, this is my home, this is my family, this is enough? And then how can we spread that message where it's so systemically backwards from that?
Good questions. I often hear this argument about the homogeneous society and that it's impossible to create this kind of economic welfare in the US. But I think people kind of get it backwards, because the Nordic countries were really ridden by conflict and were extremely poor until between First and Second World War. They were backward society, especially Swedish society, for example. People lived in extreme poverty in the working population. So it is the welfare state that created that community and trust, not the other way around. And I think it speaks to this point that if you compare the United States with the Nordic countries, trust in government and trust in your neighbor is kind of much higher in the data. I did with my translator William sitting down there. We did an contribution to the abundance debate here in the United States. I'm sure you're familiar with the book Abundance, and they are kind of talking about that the left is talking too much about redistribution and too little about state capacity. But our point in that piece was that actually state capacity needs trust in the state, and in order to have trust in the state, you need the state to deliver for normal working people. So in order to have state capacity, you need welfare. So I think it's a myth that you could not do this here. And talking about homogeneous societies, if you look at, for example, Norway and Sweden, actually there are more foreign-born persons there right now than in the US as a percentage, as I informed. So I think it's a myth. I think it's a way of saying, no, it's a kind of particularism in the Nordic countries. And I would really like to underscore that when I talk about Nordic socialism, it is not kind of a cultural essentialism. It's just a special experience that we had in the Nordic countries for different reasons. Some strains of ideas. Grundtvig did play an important role in this, and some, special situations also because, you know, when we had a really strong working class, we had a governing elite that was really afraid that workers would go even further, and that led to a lot of compromises being made. So there's a lot of reasons for that. So just to say, there's no Nordic socialism is a set of ideas and experiences that could be applied everywhere, not only in the Nordics. Regarding gender and wage inequality, we also do have that in Denmark. I don't know if it's the same degree as in the United States. But of course, you can do a lot to that inequality, and the welfare system is doing a lot of difference. Of course, universal childcare is enormously important. I've been told that a lot of young people here don't have children anymore. They have cats instead. I don't know if it's true, But if it's true, that is truly terrible, and not because I don't like cats, because I really love cats. But
I was actually just a dog person. This is just put on by big dog.
So of course you can do a lot of institutional setups to support gender equality. For example, we succeeded. In the end, the Social Democrats took over our politics, but that's a good thing because then we have made a popular point. So we succeeded in doing a deal where the branches, the groups of workers, mostly employed by women, had a quite big wage, what do you call it? Increase, yeah. The nurses, the pedagogues working in childcare, and other groups mostly dominated by women. So that was a success. But it took 20 years of struggle and strikes and political struggle, also from the parliament. But we succeeded.
Do you want to? And then the last question was
on
of
greed. I think it was more a comment, and I really liked it. Of course, greed is also something that we have in the Nordics. Unfortunately, our housing system is more and more like yours. But I think what is going on in a lot of places right now is that, and I think that also is an explanation of the kind of demographic change that a lot of young people vote to the left. And I saw this really great data of the majority of the young American people preferring socialism over capitalism. I think that was, we should put our hopes in the young generations. But I think that has an explanation because, you know, this idea of getting on the ladder and getting up and getting rich, it's so obvious for most people that it's blocked. You don't have these possibilities anymore. And I think housing is a really good example. It's impossible. So when you see that it won't be possible for you ever to have a place to live in New York, you want public housing or cooperative housing that are affordable and that you can pay and we can deliver that.
Can I ask just a follow-up question on that? In Denmark, is it also the case that younger people on the whole are trending more left? Because in some countries it's the opposite, and so I'm just interested in your experience if that plays out there. Because in the US, that's one of the things that makes it interesting about this moment. It's like socialism is new, but in a context where socialism seems old, I wonder if it has the same resonance to young people.
Yeah, it does. We have an over-representation of young people, but not a really big one. But young people vote right now in Denmark to the both sides. No one votes for the Social Democrats or the other governmental parties, but a group votes for the more kind of liberalist parties, and other votes for the socialist parties. We have three left-wing parties in Denmark to the left of the social democracy, and right now we are polling the three parties together around 25% of the votes, which is quite historical. The Social Democrats are polling around 22%. So combined, and we work closely together, we are now bigger than the Social Democracy. In Copenhagen, my party, or our party, is the biggest party. We have around 25% of the votes in the capital of Denmark, and we're having local elections now in November, and are hoping to replace 100 years of social democratic governance by a green and progressive and democratic coalition. Yeah.
We have a New York, Copenhagen mayor
yeah,
reunion.
Exactly.
Okay, we have time for more questions. Do we have...
Okay, sorry. Do I even need... Yeah, so I would say like from the start of the foundation of America, it's always been like a hyper-individualist society where, and you know, hyper-violent from the beginning, and you know, everyone kind of has this delusion where they see themselves as a future billionaire. So I would say, how do you think it's on like a fundamental level possible to change people's mindset from seeing themselves as like a future billionaire to maybe like making some concessions in their life to so their neighbors, you know, can have a decent quality of life as well?
Hi, I'm curious about the connection between economic growth in specific industries in the Nordic region the last 70, 50 years. You mentioned the growth after the war, the oil industry, obviously more recently the pharmaceutical industry in Denmark. So if it were not for the economic growth in these specific industries and large corporations, would the perception globally of the success of socialism there be different, perhaps?
Take one more before we...
Hi, I recently returned from Copenhagen attending a conference on folk schools. And I'm curious if you can comment on the role of folk schools and sort of creating a socially democratic environment in the Nordic countries, and what's the role of that kind of democratizing education going forward in the future. I would also, it's delightful to hear that you wrote something on the abundance economy. I'd really be curious for you to do an extended piece on the homogeneity question and welfare, and how do you actually see that? And I'm curious, given the increased immigration to the Nordic states and the rise of the right, like how do you understand that relationship?
I think I'm not kind of I think you know a lot more about American culture that I do. But what I know is that you also have another American history of powerful trade union organizing, of powerful communities, of powerful cooperatives. Of course, disputed, but still important history of the New Deal that was pushed through by organized people. So actually, a lot of what I describe in the book as kind of Nordic experiences. You could find experiences aligned here. Of course, the New Deal was not a welfare state, but it was organized labor doing it impossible for the political elite not to answer to their needs. You have powerful cooperatives in the US also in various sectors. You have mutuals, you have banks owned by the consumers, where it is not greed that drives the enterprise, but trying to answer to people's needs in a democratic framework. So I think what makes me optimistic and what I tried with this book is that instead of trying to say only kind of like the left has done a lot, kind of waiting for the revolution, to identify all the places, all the relations where people actually counter this idea that it's individualism. And actually, I don't really like the term individualism, because it's kind of false premise that we are not into people's individual freedom. So when I'm a socialist, it's not for socialism's sake, it's for the individual's sake. It's for the sake of people having freedom in their lives to take decision over their own destiny and not be dominated by people that are more powerful and wealthy. So I think look to all the good examples, expand them, learn from them, and I have no doubt that we are able at changing our societies. We have seen it done before, and we can do it, and we can do it again. And regarding the folkeskole. Folkeskole is our public schools in Denmark. In Denmark, you cannot make a profit from driving a school. It is forbidden. So we have private schools, but they are non-profit. So of course, that makes a huge difference in the way these schools are kind of the ideas and the foundation of the school. Still, we have some segregation among the private schools and the public schools, but we're really trying to counter that, especially in Copenhagen, with great success by financing the schools that are in areas with more diverse population and more social issues. So the folkeskole is one of the most important institution in the Nordic welfare state, together with our free healthcare system, our childcare, our elderly care, and our social services by large. So even though the Nordic countries have been kind of experienced a setback through this kind of neoliberal reforms, I think it talks to the strengths of this model, that it still stands, and that it is so difficult for the right wing or for the elite to roll back these results, because people love them. We feel it in our own bodies that we are more autonomous and free when we are not dependent on our purchasing power if we get sick, or if we get old, or if we get a red slip. And I think, and therefore I'm optimistic, because we're not only the majority. It's also so obvious that organizing our societies in a more democratic way, answering in a community and together to the most basic needs of people, kind of the needs of healthcare, the needs of childcare, the need of being able to educate, use your talent, that all these freedoms are so much stronger when we are having a strong community. So in a provocative way, I would say we are the individualist, because we are the one having the answers to how to create a good life, not only for the kind of privileged people, but for all people. And that is what socialism and Nordic socialism is about.
So that's a perfect place to end it, but I will ask you. I will ask you now.
I really tried to make an ending.
That was a beautiful ending, but I'm going to ruin it by just seeing if you could address the question of that was posed just about the relationship between the success at the height of social democracy and the rise of these industries. I think in your introduction you alluded to just the fact that in fact these models help foster innovation. I guess you're referring to in part the fact that these companies were reacting to the fact they now had to pay workers higher wages, which encouraged capital-intensive investment. But I'm wondering if you could just talk about that.
And to clarify, and I believe the question, in addition to help clarify, to correct me if I'm wrong, is also about the popular education traditions, right? So this is
high school.
For like.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, so, because I think that's something we have less of a tradition here, and I think part of it, seeing what we could learn from that.
Okay. I heard it at Folkehøjskole. Okay. Yeah, we have this system of schools that are for grown-ups and that we go, you don't have, it's not to get any kind of, what do you call it?
Degree?
Yeah, it's not, you don't get any degree. So many people ask, but why do you use half a year going to this kind of school? But it is a part of the culture, and actually was a really key part in educating the peasantry to take over their companies. So you cannot talk about the cooperative movement in Denmark without talking about Folkehøjskoler. And they are still an important, and right now I think they are used, we also have had this kind of reforms in the Nordic economies where focused on kind of expanding the workforce, by pressuring the young people to get through their education as fast as possible. And now there's some kind of reaction where I think, I don't remember the numbers, but it's a big amount of young people who go to højskole, and that's kind of also a protest against this, that, okay, you have put our pension age at 70, I have no rush getting out on the labor market. I would actually like to learn more. So that's great. But of course, the Folkehøjskole, the problem that is discussed a lot right now is that, of course, it is a majority of middle class people going there, and that is kind of it is not as diverse as it should be. But that's a discussion going on. Regarding our big companies, I could talk volumes about it, but one important part of and I always think about it when I'm in the US, but one important part of the Nordic economic model formed in the 50s and 60s was the idea of wage negotiation intersectoral. So you raised wages for everyone, and that meant that the least productive companies just went out of service, and the people there, they lost their job. But then there was a system of giving them education, so they kind of got more productive. And in that way, our productivity grew a lot, and is still, I think, one of the highest in the world. So when I go to the US, I often think about it, when you go to one of these flag store shops, there's a guy saying hello to you in the door, then you get to the escalating stairs, and there's another one saying welcome, and when you get to the end, and when you do your shopping, someone is kind of there helping you to pack your goods, at least last time I was here. And I always think about if these people were able to go to have a training and education, they would not only be able to have a lot higher salary themselves, but would also contribute to a much wealthier economy. So I think that's kind of one of the, and that came from a demand from the trade union. So it's all intertwined. But if your question is, could we have big companies if we had a more democratic economy? Yes, we could. I'm not doubting that. Actually, a lot of the Danish big companies, they're owned by non-profit funds. So it's interesting. It's a little bit special Danish. So you always argue that someone have to have their hands on the, what do you call it? Yeah, but actually, these funds are kind of non-owned, so they have, of course, a director, but no one kind of loses money if they screw up. So that's and that fund, of course, could be changed to a democratic ownership model without altering the daily operation of the company, actually. So that was the idea, and we don't have time to talk about it, but that was the idea of the wage earner funds, that you could just kind of slowly change the ownership structure without necessarily altering a lot in the daily operation of the companies. You know, capital owners today in the big companies, and now I use a really strong word, but you know, the most companies are owned today by client of BlackRock. It's not entrepreneurial ownership. They are not delivering anything. They are, and it's a hard word, it's a kind of parasitic ownership that has nothing to do with this history of capitalism, of you know, this entrepreneurial guys who creates a lot of, that exists also. But when we look to our greatest companies, they are owned by capital that is so far away from having anything to do with the daily operation of the company. So we could take that away, in my opinion, and the production would continue without people even noticing it. I think people should notice because we should use that ownership to also give empowerment and influence to the workers on the shop floor. But yeah, that would be my. So I think we should think about this as, you know, when people talked about doing democracy, political democracy, at least in Denmark, you know, we until 1915, women couldn't vote, voters couldn't vote, so we only have kind of 100 years of democracy in Denmark. And when people said that normal workers, they should have a right to vote, they were called extremists. They were called crazy people. That would never happen. That couldn't be. Normal peasants and workers were not able to take that kind of decisions. It was out of the question. And I think it's more or less the same reaction that we see today when we're saying, hey, maybe we could expand the democratic principle into our economy and our working life. Then people would react like people in favor of monarchy at that time reacted, no, it's not possible. But of course it's possible. It's just taking the last, or at least one more step in creating a real democracy where people are empowered and where all important decision rests in democratic institution and is not based on kind of oligarchic, non-democratic power.
Did you see how he brought it back at the end? It happened twice. You saw a very skilled delivery and conclusion. So big thanks to Pelle. Everyone should get a copy of the book if you have not gotten a copy of the book, Nordic Socialism. It's excellent. I'm not just saying that because I'm up here. And it has a lot more of the details that we sort of only hinted at here, where it really goes into it. So I would say even if you got the sense of the big ideas, there's a lot of meat in there that we didn't get into. So thank you again, Pelle.
Yeah, I'd like to thank all of you, and particularly Pelle. That was thought-provoking and inspiring, and a lot to work to do here. But thank you all for coming. Again, this is the American Scandinavian Foundation Scandinavia House. If you haven't been here before, please come back. We have a lot of great programs coming up in the coming months. Beginning in September, we'll be celebrating the 25th anniversary of Scandinavia House. And we have a wide variety of exhibitions, films, evenings like this, concerts, and so you're all welcome. Check out our website, scandinaviahouse.org or amscan.org. And Pelle, I hope you'll come back. Thank you very much.